In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about classes and objects in PHP. Now, a lot of times in PHP, we're going to be dealing with different types of data. And in PHP, we have a certain set of data types that we can work with. So we can represent things like strings, which are just plain text. We can represent whole numbers like integers and decimal numbers. We can also represent true false values like booleans. But here's the problem is a lot of times when we're writing our PHP programs, we're not going to be able to represent everything just using like a single string or a single boolean or a single number. Like there's a lot of like real world entities like in the real world that can't just be broken down into a single string or a single number. Like for example, like we could represent something simple like someone's age, for example. Like I could create an age variable over here and I could set it equal to like 90, right? Maybe someone's 90 years old. For something simple like that, like someone's age, we can easily represent it with, you know, something like a number. But there's a lot of things in the real world that can't be represented with just a number or a string or a boolean. And essentially the problem is that we only have these, 3 or 4 different data types. And so the types of information that we can represent and model in our programs is very limited. So PHP recognizes this problem, right? The problem that we can't represent everything in the real world just with a single string or number. So in PHP, we can actually create our own custom data types. And we can do that by creating things called classes. A class is essentially just a specification for a custom data type. So just like we have the string data type and like an integer data type, a Boolean data type, I could create my own custom data type that would allow me to model something in the real world, right? So a string, for example, represents like plain text. A number represents a number. But I could create a custom data type to represent something like a phone, or I could represent like a keyboard, or I could represent a water bottle. Like I could represent anything I could think of in the real world using a class because I'm able to create my own custom data type. So in this tutorial, we are going to create our own class, which like I said is a custom data type. And then we're gonna use that inside of our program. So let's say for the purposes of this tutorial that we're writing a piece of software for a library, right? So let's say that we want to, write some software that will help a library manage all of its books. So what we're actually gonna do is we're gonna create a book class. And this book class will basically allow us to represent and model books inside of our PHP program. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create a class. I'm just going to come down here in my PHP tags and I'm just going to type class and then a space, and now we want to type the name of the class that we want to create. In my case, I'm going to create a book class because I want to be able to model a book inside of my program. And so I'm just going to type book like that. And a lot of times when we're creating classes, people will use a capital letter. It's not necessary, but that's just kind of like a pretty common convention. Then I'm going to type an open and close curly bracket, and I'm just going to enter a few times. So inside of this open and close curly bracket, we can start writing our custom data type. We can start creating our class. Now, whenever we create classes in PHP, what we're actually going to do is we're going to take this book and we're going to break it up into a series of attributes. So remember, by default in PHP, we have like strings, we have numbers, and we have booleans. So we can represent all of that information by default. But when we create a new data type, generally what we're going to do is create the new data type based off of those other data types. So for example, with this book class, what I want to do is define a series of attributes that represent a book. And so what I can do is I can actually start thinking of what different attributes are going to make up a book. Let's try to think of some. I think a good set of attributes would be a title, an author, and a number of pages. So every book has a title, every book has an author, and every book has a number of pages. So inside of this book class, I can basically say that every book should have a title, an author, and a number of pages. And I can do that by defining attributes. So the way I can create attributes is I can just come in here and I can say var, and then I can make a $sign and I'm going to type out the name of the attribute. So like I said, a book is going to have a title, and I'm going to type a semicolon. A book is also going to have an author, and a book is also going to have a number of pages. So I'm just going to type pages. So essentially what I'm doing here is I'm telling PHP that I want to create a new book data type. And this book data type is going to be composed of a title, an author, and pages. So every book inside of our program will have a title, an author, and pages. And so essentially this class is a specification. So it's like a blueprint for creating a book inside of my program. What I can do now is I can come down here below this class declaration and I can actually create a book inside of my program. So I could model a real book in my PHP program. And we can create a book in our program much like we would create a variable in our program. So I can make this $, and I could just call this like book1, for example. And I'm gonna set this equal to new book, just like that. And essentially what this is doing is it's creating a new book data type and it's storing it inside of this book variable. So up here, we created this book class. And this is basically just a blueprint. It's a template for what a book is inside of our program. And down here, I created an actual book. And this is what we call an object. So an object is an instance of a class. Like I said, a class is a blueprint for our book, right? The book class is basically just defining what a book is. And down here, I'm creating an actual book. And so because this is an actual book, I can give it its own title, its own author, and its own number of pages. I could come down here and I could say book 1, and I can make a dash and a greater than sign, and I can say title, and I'm just gonna set this equal to something. So I could say the title of this book is gonna be Harry Potter. So let's say that this is a Harry Potter book. And I could do this for each of the attributes. So I could also say book 1 author, and the author of the Harry Potter books is J.K. Rowling. And then finally we can say book 1 and pages, and we can give this a number of pages. So let's say it has 400 pages. So essentially what I did is I created a book in my program and I gave that book a title, I gave that book an author, and I gave that book a number of pages. So what I could do is I could actually come down here and I could print some of this information out. So I could echo out like book 1 title. And now this is gonna print out the title of book 1. So we should get Harry Potter. And you'll see over here we're printing out Harry Potter. I could do the same thing for the other attributes, so like the author. Now we're gonna be printing out the author of book 1, which is J.K. Rowling. So before in my program, before I created that book class, I had no way of representing a book, right? I had no way of like storing or representing or modeling a book inside of my program. But now, since I created this book class, I basically created a template for what a book is. I created a book data type. And now I can use that book data type to create variables. So now this book 1 variable is actually storing a book object. And remember, an object is just an instance of a book. So we created this Harry Potter book, and actually, why don't we come down here and we'll create another book. So I'm actually just gonna copy this whole thing and we'll paste this down here. So in addition to creating a Harry Potter book, let's say we wanted to create a Lord of the Rings book. I'm actually gonna change this to book 2. So instead of being called book 1, I'm changing this to book 2. And I can do the same thing, I can say new book. And now over here, we're gonna change this. So this is gonna be a Lord of the Rings book, and the author is Tolkien. And let's say the Lord of the Rings has like 700 pages. So essentially what I'm doing now is I'm creating a new book, and this time it's a Lord of the Rings book. The author is Tolkien, and it has 700 pages. So here I have book 1. This is a Harry Potter book. The author is J.K. Rowling. Down here I have book 2, and this is a Lord of the Rings book. So I could do the same thing for book 2. I could print out like book 2, and the author of book 2 is gonna be Tolkien. So now we're printing out Tolkien. So just like I can create 2 strings, like I could come down here in my program and I could create like string 1, and this would be like whatever, and I could create another string like string 2, and this is gonna be whatever. Just like I can create 2 strings in my program, I can also create 2 books. So we basically created a new data type. And it's important to know the difference. So up here we have a class. A class is basically just a blueprint. It's a specification for what a book is in our program. We're basically defining the new data type. Down here, we're creating what are called objects. An object is an instance of a class. So an object is an actual book. So we have a book object, and it has the title Harry Potter, the author J.K. Rowling, and 400 pages. Down here we have another book object with the title Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, and 700. So these are both books, but they have different titles, they have different authors, and they have different pages. And that is the beauty of classes and objects, is we can take something complex like a book and we can represent it inside of our programs. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about constructors in PHP. A constructor is basically just a special function that we can put inside of a class, which is going to get called when we create an object of that class. And we can actually use these constructors to do a bunch of cool stuff. And in this tutorial, I'm going to just give you an introduction into constructors, and then we're actually going to be able to use constructors to give our objects some default information. So it'll make it a lot easier for us to create objects in PHP. Now, if you're following along with this course, in the last tutorial, I talked to you guys about classes and objects. And we created this book class over here. And we basically said that the book is going to have a title, an author, and a number of pages. And then down here, we created two book objects. So we have book 1, and the title was Harry Potter, and this was like J.K. Rowling, 400 pages. And then we created another book object down here, and it was a Lord of the Rings book, and the author was Tolkien, and it had 700 pages. So we created our two book objects, and we created our book class, and everything went pretty well. So I want to show you guys another thing we can do inside of this class, which is use something called a constructor. And a constructor, like I said, it's basically a function that's going to get called whenever we create an object of the class. So down here, I'm going to create a constructor, and we'll kind of see what they do. So basically, all we want to do is just say function, and I'm going to type 2 underscores, just like that. So 1, 2 underscores, and then construct, just like that. And it needs to be named construct. If you don't name it exactly like that, then this isn't going to work. So then over here, we're going to make an open and close curly bracket. So far, this is just a normal function, right? It looks exactly like any other functions that we've used throughout this course. And what I want to show you guys is that whenever we create a new book object, like we did down here, this function gets executed. So I'm going to go ahead and just type out echo, and I'll just say new book created. And so now, actually, I'm going to type a break here too, just so we can see this a little bit better. So now when I go over here and I run this program on the browser, you'll see we're printing out new book created 2 times. And actually what's happening is we create these 2 books. So down here I say new book, and I also say new book down here. And whenever we say this, like I said, this constructor function gets executed. So then over here, the first time we create the book, it says this, and then we create another book and it prints this out. I want to illustrate this a little bit further just to really kind of like instill what's going on. So this works just like any normal function. So just like any other function, I could pass it some information. So I could say like this function is going to take a parameter called name, and then let's say down here, I just want to print out the name that gets passed in. So what I could do now down here when I create these new books, I could pass in a name. So I could pass in like Mike, and I could pass in Tom. And I'll show you guys, when we run this program now, it's going to print out Mike, and then it's going to print out Tom, because those are the 2 values that are getting passed into the constructor. So we're printing out Mike, and then we're printing out Tom, just like that. So hopefully you guys see the relationship now. Whenever I say new book down here, when I say this, it's actually calling that constructor function. So that is extremely important, and this is actually really useful. So we can use this to do all sorts of stuff in our classes. I just want to point one thing out. So down here, when we created these books, right, I created book 1 and I created book 2, but you'll notice how many lines of code it took us to do this. So just to create one book up here, it took me 4 full lines of code, right? I had to actually like create the object, and then I gave a value to the title, gave a value to the author, and gave a value to the pages. Right, so I had to individually say like book 1 title is equal to Harry Potter, book 1 author is equal to J.K. Rowling. Like, it was a lot of work for me to create this book object, and I had to do it twice. This was only creating 2 books. Imagine if we had to create like 20 or 30 of these different books in our program. the amount of lines of code it would take up would be ridiculous. Like this alone is taking up 8 lines of code. So I want to show you guys how we can use that constructor function that we just looked at in order to make it a lot easier for us to create these objects. So remember, we can pass information into this constructor, right? I specified that this would take some parameters, and then we passed parameters in it down here and everything worked. What we can actually do is we can pass in the book's title, the book's author, and the number of pages of the book into this constructor function. And then inside this constructor function, we can give those values to the title, the author, and the pages. So essentially we can do everything we did down here, but inside of this constructor. So let me show you guys how that works. Over here in the constructor, I'm going to specify that I want to take in 3 parameters. I'm going to take in the first parameter, I'm just going to call it a title. And the second parameter, I'm going to call it a author. And the third parameter, I'm going to call it a pages. And you'll notice I'm putting this little lowercase a in front of title, author, and pages. You don't have to do that. I'm just doing that because it's going to be easier for us to see what's going on if these have, if these are named like this. But you'll see in a second, we can name those whatever we want. So now that we specify that this needs to take some parameters, what we can actually do is we can take the values that the user passes in and we can assign them to the values for the object. So I can basically do exactly what I did down here, but just up here in this constructor. So what I want to do is I want to say $this. And this is actually a keyword in PHP, and it's going to refer to the current object. And I'll kind of explain this a little bit more in a second, but I'm going to say this title is equal to a title. So I'm setting the title of the current object equal to the value that got passed in. And I'm going to do this for all of these. So I'll just say this author is equal to a author. And then finally we'll say this pages is equal to a pages. All right, so we basically said this title is equal to the title that got passed in, this author is equal to the author that got passed in, and this pages is equal to the pages that got passed in. Now, I want you guys to notice some similarities. I'm saying this arrow title, and then down here I'm saying book 1 arrow title. And actually, these are doing the same thing. So when I use this keyword, it's basically just referring to the current object that's getting created, right? So down here, I create the object, and then I manually give it a title, an author, and a number of pages. Over here, when the object gets created and this construct function gets called, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm just doing it over here. And I can use this keyword in order to do the same thing that I did down here. So instead of saying book 1, I just say this. And like I said, this keyword is just a keyword that we can use inside of this constructor function, which essentially just means that it's the title of the object that's getting created. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so what I can do now is whenever I create a new book, I can pass in all of this information. So I can pass in like Harry Potter, and I can pass in the author Rowling, and I can pass in the pages like 400. And now I can get rid of all of this because we're doing all that stuff inside of the constructor. And then I'm gonna do the same thing for Lord of the Rings real quick. All right, so I put all of this stuff in there for Lord of the Rings, and again, I'm gonna get rid of this. So now, instead of it taking 8 lines of code for us to create these objects, it only takes 2 lines of code. And I'm calling this constructor and I'm passing in the title that I want to give to the object, the author that I want to give to the object, and the number of pages I want to give to the object. And then up here in the constructor, we're assigning the value of title to the title that got passed in, the value of author to the author that got passed in, etc. So basically now we did exactly what we did before, but we just saved ourselves a bunch of time and a bunch of code. All right, so I'm gonna prove this to you guys. I'm gonna come down here and why don't we just echo out like book 1 title. So we're gonna echo out the title of book 1 and we should get Harry Potter, so we do. So this is working exactly like it worked before. It's just way easier for us to create these objects. And the thing that's cool about this is I could still modify these values. So if I wanted to come over here, I could still say like book 1 title is equal to, and I could give this a different value. So we can make this like Hunger Games or something. And now the book one's title is going to be updated. So instead of being Harry Potter, it's going to be Hunger Games. The whole point of using this constructor is that we can give this information right up front. So I don't have to manually set it. I can just do it right away, and the object has some initial information. So that is how constructors can be used, and constructors are extremely useful. A lot of times when people create classes, they'll create constructors for those classes. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about object functions in PHP. An object function is basically just a function that we can define inside of a class, and then the different objects of that class can use that function. So these are super useful, and a lot of times we're going to want to create a bunch of these little object functions that will either tell us information about the current object or modify the current object or do something like that. So I'm going to explain exactly what these are, exactly what they do, and how we can use them. So over here, I created a student class. So this is basically a class that I created, and it's essentially just modeling a student in my program. And I'm basically saying that every student has a name, a major, and a GPA. So it's pretty simple. And then down here, I have my constructor function. So I'm able to pass in the name, the major, and the GPA. And then down here, I assign the name that gets passed in equal to the name of the actual object. So then here down below this class, I created a couple students. So I have a variable called student1, and it's storing a student object whose name is Jim. He's a business major, and he has a 2.8 GPA. And then down here we have student 2. Her name is Pam. She's an art major, and she has a GPA of 3.6. So these are the two students that we can work with in our program. So far, hopefully this stuff makes sense, right? This is essentially what we talked about in the last couple lessons. But in this tutorial, I want to show you guys how we can make object functions. And like I said, an object function is basically just a function that each of these objects could use in order to like do specific tasks or find out different information. So what I want to do is I want to write a function which is going to tell me whether or not the current student is on the honor roll. So let's say that we're writing a program for like a college or a university, and we want to be able to easily figure out whether or not a particular student is on the honor roll, right? And let's say that the rules for the honor roll is like you need a 3.5 or above. What I could do is I could actually create an object function up here inside of this class, and that function will be able to tell me whether or not the particular student has honors. So let's go ahead and do that, and hopefully as we go through, you'll kind of see what we're doing. So down here below this constructor, I'm going to create a function, and I can create this just like I would create any other function. I'm just going to say function, and then I'm going to give it a name. So I'm basically going to call this has honors. And this function is going to return a true or a false value. So if the student has honors, then it's going to return true. If the student doesn't have honors, then it's going to return false. So I'm actually going to go ahead and start writing this function. So like I said, the rules for honors is going to be if you have a GPA of 3.5 or above, then we're going to say you have honors. But if you have a GPA lower than 3.5, then you're not going to have honors, so you're not going to be on the honor roll. So what I could do is I could just create like a simple if statement. So I could say if, and I basically just want to check to see if the object that's calling this function has honors or not. So what I can do is I can come up here into these parentheses, and I want to check to see if the student's GPA is greater than or equal to 3.5. And the way that I can access the current student's GPA is just by saying $ this hyphen greater than sign, and then the name of the attribute, so it's going to be GPA, and I want to check to see if it's greater than or equal to 3.5. If it is greater than or equal to 3.5, then down here we can just return true. If it's not though, down here we'll just return false. So this is actually going to return a true or a false value. Now, here's the thing. Whenever we're printing out true or false values, PHP isn't actually going to be able to print out false, and it's not going to be able to print out true either. So instead of passing Booleans back here, I'm actually just going to pass a string back true and a string back false. But just know that most likely you'd want to be passing back Booleans. For the purposes of this tutorial, though, I'm just going to pass back these strings. so it's a little bit easier for us to see what's going on. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and you'll see I can actually use this new function that we created on both of these objects. So I could, for example, echo out and I could say student1 hyphen greater than sign has honors. And what this is going to do is it's going to go ahead and it's going to call that has honors function for student1. So when I come over here and I refresh my page, and actually looks like I forgot to put a semicolon over here. Sorry about that. So now when I refresh the page, this should say false. And the reason it says false is because student1 has a GPA of 2.8, right? Jim's GPA is a 2.8, so it's not 3.5 or greater, and therefore Jim is going to not have honors. If I came down here then and I changed this to student2, so now this is going to be Pam. Pam is going to have honors, so this should give us back true. And you can see over here we're getting true. And that's because Pam's GPA is 3.6, which means it's above 3.5. So let's go back over to this function, and I want to explain it a little bit more. You'll notice that I wrote this function one time, and I was able to use it on the Pam object, and I was also able to use it on the Jim object. And that's one of the cool things about these object functions is I can write the function one time and then all of the instances of the student class can use it. So every student object can use this has honors function in order to figure out whether or not they have honors. And here's the thing, you'll notice that when Jim called this has honors function, we used Jim's GPA in order to figure out whether or not he had honors. When Pam called the has honors function, we used Pam's GPA 3.6 in order to figure out whether or not Pam had honors. And this is actually really significant. So when I call this function on the Pam object, over here when I say this arrow GPA, that means that we're going to use Pam's GPA. When I call the has honors function on the Jim object, again, this is going to go ahead and use Jim's GPA. So by saying $this GPA, this is always going to refer to the GPA of the object that's calling the function. And that's why these are so powerful. So a lot of times what people will do is they'll create like a bunch of these little functions inside of their class. And you can see like this has honors function comes in handy a lot, right? Because this is essentially specifying the qualifications for honors, right? So if I wanted, I could make the qualifications for honors be a 2.5, and now technically Jim's going to qualify for honors, or I could make it a, 4.5 or a 4.0 or something like that. But in addition to a has honors function, I mean, I'm sure we could think of a bunch of other functions that we might want to use on a particular student. But hopefully that makes sense. And really what you want to do is whenever you create a class in PHP, you always want to think about what are the different functions, the different object functions that you can include inside of that class. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about getters and setters in PHP. Now, getters and setters are basically special functions that we can create inside of our PHP classes, which allow us to control the access that people have to the attributes of those classes. So I understand that that definition might not make any sense, but in this video, I'm going to show you exactly why getters and setters are useful and how we can use them in our classes. So first, let me just show you guys what I have down here. I created a class, it's called Movie, and this class has a title and it has a rating. So it has two attributes, title and rating, and then down here I just created a constructor so we can pass in a title and a rating, and then those values get assigned to the object attributes. Then down here, like right below the class, I created a movie object. So it's just called Avengers, and it's just the Avengers movie, and it's rated PG-13. So pretty simple. Basically, we're just creating a movie inside of our program. So this is pretty cool. And then down here, I was printing out the Avengers rating just to kind of prove that everything works. So I want to talk to you guys about one potential problem that we might run into with this movie class. Let's say that we're designing a program that is going to be able to work with and store a bunch of different movies, right? And one of the things about a movie is that every movie has a rating, right? So this movie is PG-13. Some other movies are like G, R, PG, NR, right? There's a bunch of these different ratings that we can give to these movies. Now here's the thing, there's really only like a certain number of valid ratings for a movie, right? We have like G, PG, PG-13, R, and then NR. So NR would be like not rated, right? I mean, for the most part, these are all of the like valid ratings that we can give to a movie. Maybe there's some other ones, but let's just say that these are the only valid ratings that we could give to a movie. Well, here's the problem with this movie class, is that over here, I could actually give this a invalid rating. So I could come over here and I could give this a rating of like dog, right? Just some random word. And now when we print out the rating, you'll see we're printing out dog. So I was able to give this movie a rating that wasn't one of the like valid ratings. And if you're just creating like a simple movie class, you might not care about that. But if you're designing like a real application that's going to be able to store and work with movies, you might want to limit the ratings that these movies can have. So you might not want this movie to have a rating of dog, right? You might want it to only be able to be one of these valid ratings over here. And up until this point, we haven't really talked about how we can control what values can be stored inside of these object attributes. But we're going to talk about that right now. So I'm basically going to show you guys how we can make it so the user can't give the rating a value other than G, PG, PG-13, R, or NR. We're basically going to tighten down this class and make it so the rating can only have a certain number of values. So in order to do this, we're actually going to have to do a couple different things. So I'm going to change this back to PG-13. The first thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to modify this rating attribute. So up here in my program, you'll notice I'm creating my rating attribute. I'm just saying public $rating. So right now, down here in my program, I'm able to access the rating, right? I can print it out, I can modify it if I wanted to, I could basically do whatever I wanted to it. But the first step in controlling what ratings can get put in here is gonna be to cut off access to this rating attribute. So I basically wanna make it so I can't print out the rating attribute, so I can't modify the rating attribute, so I can't do anything to it. So for example, like right now, I could come over here and say Avengers rating is equal to dog. There's nothing stopping me from doing this, and over here, it's the same thing, it's dog, right? What I wanna do is make it so I can no longer do that. And what we can do is we can come up here and we can make this a private attribute. So this brings me to the first point that I wanna talk to you guys about in this tutorial, which are called visibility modifiers. And a visibility modifier is basically a keyword that's going to tell PHP what code is able to access and use different attributes in our programs. Now, you'll notice over here that I have this public keyword right here. And what this public keyword means is that this attribute is visible to any other code in my PHP program. So when I say public over here, it means I can come down here, I can give this rating a value, and I can print out that value onto the screen. Public is essentially just like it's open to everybody. So everybody can access it, everybody can modify it, everybody can do whatever they want to it. Previously in this course, we were using this keyword var, and I intentionally used this keyword var just because I didn't want to talk about these visibility modifiers until this tutorial. But var basically does the same thing. So var and public for the most part are kind of interchangeable. Generally though, in like modern day PHP, you're gonna be seeing people use this public keyword. Again, I wanted to introduce that in this tutorial, so that's why we were using var in the previous tutorials. But whenever I say public and then specify the attribute inside of a class, it basically means that this attribute is open to the world, it's open to everybody. But what we want to do with this rating attribute is we want to tighten it up. So we want to make it so that nobody can access it outside of this movie class. What I could do is I could come over here and I could give this a different visibility modifier called private. So I could say private rating. And basically what this means is that any code outside of this movie class now, so in other words, any code outside of these open and closed curly brackets isn't going to be able to access the rating directly. So down here, we're not going to be able to set the rating like this, and we're not going to be able to print it out. So if I came over here and I refreshed my program, you'll see we're getting this fatal error. It says, cannot access private property movie rating. Basically, it's telling us like, hey, that movie's rating is private, so you can't access it anymore. And like I said, when we set something as private, it means that only code inside of the class that it's declared is able to use it. So for example, down here, we're able to set the rating just fine. right? We have no problems doing that. It's because this code is inside the movie class. But any code that's outside the movie class isn't going to be able to mess with this rating attribute. So that's the first step in order to make it so we can only set specific ratings on this movie. The second set is going to be creating something called a getter and a setter. And getters and setters are special functions that we can write inside of our classes, which will allow the user to set the attribute. So it'll allow the user to essentially do something like this, and it'll allow the user to get the attribute, essentially do something like this. So because rating is private, I can't set it directly anymore, and I can't get it directly anymore down here to print it out. So what we can do is we could actually come up here and we can create some functions. So I'm gonna come up here and create a function, and I'm just gonna call this get rating. And what this is gonna do is it's basically just going to return this rating. So whenever somebody calls this get rating function, it's basically going to give them the rating. And so down here, I'm actually just going to get rid of this line of code. If I wanted to get the rating and print it out, instead of saying avengers.rating, remember, this is throwing an error. We can't do this. What I can do, though, is I can say avengers arrow get rating, and now I should be able to get the rating, even though the rating is private. So you can see now we're able to get PG-13. So I can get the rating using this get rating function. I can also create a set rating function. So I could come down here, say function, and I can just call this set rating. And this set rating function is actually going to take one parameter. It's going to take one argument. Up here, I'm just going to call this rating. So we're going to allow the user to pass in a rating into here. And then down here, what I can do is I can say this rating is equal to rating. So I'm setting the rating for this object equal to the rating that got passed in. And basically this will allow me to update the rating. So with this set rating function, I could come down here and I could say like Avengers set rating, and I could technically give this any rating that I wanted. So if I wanted, I could give this a dog, right? And basically what this is doing is it's allowing us to set the rating and get the rating, even though the rating itself is private. So up here, rating is private. We're not able to access it outside the class, but by using this get rating function and this set rating function, I can both get it and set it. So now that we have these set up, we can actually start enforcing some rules. So like I said, the goal is to make it so we can't do this. So we can't set the rating equal to something that's not G, PG, PG-13, R, or NR, right? That is the overall goal of this tutorial. And so what I can do is inside of this set rating function, I can actually enforce that rule. So over here, instead of just saying this rating is equal to rating, I'm gonna get rid of this. And instead, I'm gonna put an if statement in here. And I'm gonna check to see if the rating that they passed in is one of the valid ratings that we specified down here. And if it is, then I'll let them set the rating. But if it's not, then we can do something else. So I'm basically gonna create an if statement. And inside of this if statement parentheses, I basically wanna check to see, like I said, if the rating that they passed in is one of the valid ratings. Now, there's a couple different ways that we could check this. I'm just gonna go ahead and use a bunch of or statements. So I'm basically gonna say, if rating is equal to G, or rating is equal to PG, etc. So I'm gonna go off and create one of these for each one of those ratings, and then we'll come back and see how it looks. So I actually went ahead and I created this like super long if statement. And honestly, there's easier ways that we could do something like this. But just for simplicity's sake, I wanted to do it this way. So down here I said, if the rating is equal to G, or the rating is equal to PG, or the rating is equal to PG-13, or the rating is equal to R, or the rating is equal to NR. So if it's equal to one of these ratings, in other words, if it's a valid rating, then down here we can basically just say this rating is equal to rating. And the reason I'm doing this is because if it passes this if statement condition, that means it's one of the valid ratings. So we can just go ahead and set it, right? That means that they passed in a valid rating and we're good to go. Otherwise though, I'm going to create an else block over here. If they didn't enter in a valid rating, why don't we just say this rating is equal to NR? So why don't we just pass it an NR? So let's say if they try to enter in a rating of like dog or some other nonsense, then we're basically just going to say the movie's not rated because they didn't give us a valid rating. All right, so the whole point is that now if I want to set the rating to something like dog, it has to go through this set rating function. And when it goes through that set rating function, we have this if statement, which is going to filter out all of the invalid ratings and set them equal to NR. So now essentially what's happening is when I run this program, even though I passed in dog over here, now when I print out the rating, it's going to be NR. And that's because I passed in an invalid rating. It didn't make it through that if statement and it just got set to NR. But if I set a valid rating, like if I set this equal to R, now it's going to be fine with that. So it's basically just going to be able to print out R because, hey, that's a valid rating, right? All right, so that's basically how that setter is going to work. And there's actually one more thing that we have to do. So there's one problem with this program the way it is, and it's this constructor. So the way that we have the program written, I could come over here and I could still set this equal to dog by passing it into the constructor. And you'll see over here, it's still able to be set to dog. So the last thing that we can do is just come up here to this constructor, and instead of saying this rating is equal to rating, we can just say this set rating, and we can pass in rating into here. So now every place where this rating gets set is going through this set rating. So now we're not going to be able to get away with putting dog inside of the constructor. Now it's going to be set to not rated like that. So this attribute is officially locked down. We officially cannot give a movie an invalid rating. It's impossible for me to do that. I cannot give a movie a rating other than NRR, PG-13, PG, or G. Even if I try to, like even if I come over here and pass it into the constructor, or I come down here and, you know, I say like Avengers set rating and I, you know, pass in some nonsense string, that's not going to work, right? And the way that I was able to do that was I made this attribute private. So I set rating equal to private, and I created a getter function and I created a setter function. The getter function basically just returns the rating, and the setter function has this if statement, which is going to filter out any bad ratings for us and just set them equal to NR. And then finally, up here in the constructor, I called that set rating function. So that is basically how we can use getters and setters. And one important takeaway from this tutorial was public and private. Again, before in the tutorial, I was just using this var keyword. And again, I was just using that because I wanted to explain public and private in this tutorial, and I didn't want you guys to get confused. But for the most part, people are only going to be using public and private. You won't see people using var too much, although you can use it. But remember, public means that the attribute is open to anybody, any program, anywhere. Private, though, means that only code inside the movie class is going to be able to access this attribute. In this tutorial, I'm going to talk to you guys about inheritance in PHP. Now, inheritance is basically where a class can inherit all of the functionality, all the attributes from another class in PHP. And this is actually a really useful situation. And the best way to kind of wrap your head around inheritance is just to see an example. So I'm going to show you guys an example of what this is, how it works, and then hopefully you can understand like basically what's going on. All right, so down here in my program, I've created a class called chef. And this is basically just like modeling a chef in my program. And this is a very simple class. The chef can do three things. The chef can make chicken, so we have this make chicken function. The chef can make salad, we have this make salad function. And the chef can also make a special dish. And basically all these functions do is like when the chef makes chicken, it just prints out, hey, the chef's making chicken. Or when the chef makes a salad, it prints out the chef makes salad. And for the special dish, it's barbecue ribs. So down here outside of the class, I created a chef and I told the chef to make some chicken. So now over here in my web browser, you see when I refresh the page, it just says the chef makes chicken. So this is a, like I said, pretty basic program. We have our class, it has a bunch of functions in it. We created an object and we told the object to make chicken. But let's say that I'm looking at my program and I'm thinking to myself, I want another chef in my program. So in addition to having this chef class over here, let's say that I wanted to create another chef alongside of it. So let's say in addition to just having like a generic chef up here, I also wanted to have an Italian chef. So like a more specialized type of chef. Well, I could just create another class. So I can just come over here and say class, and why don't we call this Italian chef? And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make an open and closed curly bracket. And down here in the Italian chef class, I could, write some functions or some attributes or whatever. But let's say that in our program, we wanted the Italian chef to be able to do everything that the normal chef could do, plus a bunch of other stuff, right? So just like this normal chef, the Italian chef can also make chicken, make salad, and make a special dish. So the Italian chef can do everything that the normal chef can do. And let's say the Italian chef can also do some other stuff as well. Well, this is a situation where we can use something called inheritance. And inheritance is basically where I could have my Italian chef inherit all of the functionality from the normal chef. So I could just come over here and say Italian chef extends chef. And basically what this means now is the Italian chef is going to be able to use all the same functions as the normal chef. I could actually come down here and in addition to just creating a normal chef, I'm also going to create an Italian chef. So I'm just going to paste this and I'm going to change this to Italian chef. All right, so in addition to this normal chef up here, I also created an Italian chef. It's a new Italian chef, and I'm telling this Italian chef to make chicken. Now here's the thing, up here in my Italian chef class, I didn't actually define a make chicken method. Like nowhere in here does it say make chicken, right? It's just not in here. But what I did was I extended all the functionality from the chef class. And the chef class over here has a make chicken function. So because the chef has a make chicken function and I'm inheriting all the functionality from the chef class, my Italian chef is going to be able to make chicken no problem. So now when I run my program, you'll see it says the chef makes chicken, and this is that normal chef. And down here, the Italian chef is also making chicken. So without having to write out the make chicken function down here, I was still able to use it because of inheritance. And that's why inheritance is so cool. But here's the thing, like this Italian chef, if it only has the functionality of the chef class, there's no purpose for it. So over here, we could actually create another function. I'm going to call this make pasta. So let's say in addition to making chicken salad and special dish, the Italian chef can also make a mean bowl of pasta. So down here, we could just do basically what we did before. So I'm just going to echo out like, so now down here, the Italian chef could make pasta. But here's the thing, this normal chef isn't going to be able to make pasta. So I couldn't come over here and say normal chef make pasta. This is actually going to throw an error. And that's because the chef doesn't have a make pasta method. Only the Italian chef is capable of making pasta because only the Italian chef has that function. So over here now when I refresh the page, you can see the Italian chef is making pasta. Anytime we have two classes like the chef and the Italian chef, where the Italian chef can do everything the chef can do plus some other stuff, we want to use inheritance, and this can be extremely powerful. I want to show you guys one more thing that we can do with this though, and it's called overriding a function. So down here, I'm going to have both of these guys print out make special dish. So both chefs are going to go ahead and make a special dish, and you'll see that both of them are going to make barbecue ribs. So the special dish is barbecue ribs, and then the Italian chef also makes barbecue ribs. But let's say that the Italian chef doesn't want to make barbecue ribs. So the normal chef's special dish is barbecue ribs. That's awesome. But let's say that we want the Italian chef to have a different special dish. Well, I can actually do something called overriding a function. Basically down here, I could override the make special dish function that I inherited from the chef class. And it's actually really easy. All I have to do is just come down here and I could just say function make special dish. So you'll notice I'm using the same name as the function that was up here in the chef class. And then over here, I can basically just put my own thing. So I could just say like echo the chef makes chicken parm. Maybe that's the chef's special dish. So now when I come down here and I say chef make special dish and Italian chef make special dish, they're both going to be making different special dishes. So now the Italian chef makes chicken parm and the normal chef makes barbecue ribs. And that's what we would call overriding a function. Basically, we're overriding the make special dish function that we got from the chef when we used inheritance. And that can come in handy all the time. So that's sort of the basics of inheritance and really the basics of using this extends keyword. As your PHP programs get more complex and as you start using more and more complex classes, using something like inheritance can become very useful. So hopefully all that makes sense, and hopefully now you guys have a solid understanding of what inheritance is.